A very warm welcome to everyone, and a particular welcome, of course, to Maike Oergel, Professor Oergel, the University of Nottingham. It's an absolute delight to welcome you in our virtual midst, Maike. Just for those of you who don't know, but I'm sure most of you will, Professor Oergel is the director of the Center for Translation and Comparative Cultural Studies at the University of Nottingham, and she is one of the very true experts on Anglo-German comparative studies, with a particular emphasis on the 18th and 19th century. Amongst her monographs, I would like to mention two. The first one, Culture and Identity, Historicity in German Literature and Thought from 1770 to 1815. And this spectrum from 1770 to 1815 somehow also represents the thrust of a number of other publications that I will not mention by Maike Oergel. In so many ways, Culture and Identity, if I may say so, Maike, made your name. And the other major publication of a very recent date will continue to make your name, namely the Zeitgeist, How Ideas Travel, Politics, Culture, and the Public in the Age of Revolution, published by the Greuter in 2019. Very much a landmark study on the meaning of Zeitgeist in this particular context. But I would also like to mention at least one of your non-monographs, but an article which you very generously gave to our yearbook, Anglo-German of the Center for Anglo-German Cultural Relations. And this deals with politics, radicalism, and Anglo-German relations, the reception of Ernst Moritz Arndt in the early 19th century Britain. So with that, it is an absolute pleasure to hand over to you, Maike, and please tell us more about what is at your heart when it comes to, shall we say, the reception of Germania and other problems of the 19th century and how it relates to our main concern, Anglo-German relations. Over to you.
Thank you, Rüdiger, for this lovely introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. So, Britain, Germany, and Brexit. I'll get onto Brexit in the end, but first I want to talk about the legacy of the 19th century Germanic. In case you're wondering why I'm wearing a coat, I'm in the office, but in this building the heating has broken down, so it's a bit chilly, but that shall not deter me. So, the Germanic. The questions really that I want to address is, well, what is it? Well, it's a construction. What has it got to do with Britain and England? Well, the short answer, it was deployed in 19th century narratives of national identity just as much in England as it was in Germany. And what are the similarities and the differences between the interpretations of the Germanic in England, in Britain, and in Germany? I'm going to spend quite a lot of time on the similarities to start with, but I'll get onto the differences and perhaps a sort of snapshot of what I perhaps think the differences of these interpretations are. For Britain, the Germanic seems to evidence the cradle of democracy. That's what they are, that's their Germanic. Whereas the German Germanic seems to be focused more on some sort of notion of being the heart of Europe. All of them are constructions. We'll come back to that. So, Germanic. This idea is linked to what one might call the myth of the North. which becomes prominent or more prominent in the late 18th century and in the 19th century. Again, it's a construction. This north, of course, has an opposite, that's the south, and that's not so much Southern Europe or the countries of Southern Europe of today, but classical antiquity. So this is a contrast between ancient and modern. So myth of the North and Germanic identity, what does it refer to? Well, very, very broadly, it refers to groups descending from peoples who are wandering around Europe during the slow decline of the Roman Empire, so the Völkerwanderungen, who had contact with the empire and who eventually become Christian. And normally or frequently, peoples of Germanic ethnicity. But there are various ways of including certainly the Celts in this myth of the North and even Slavs, although there's quite a lot of fence sitting regarding the Slavs, but that's not our topic today. The main job of these peoples was in the understanding of the kind of trajectory of the Germanic to create modern post-classical Europe. One other term that often comes up, particularly in late 18th century English, when they talk about the Germanic, is Gothic. In fact, Gothic precedes the widespread use of Germanic to denote these northern tribes in English. But again, that is a slightly different story. But the terms Germanic, Gothic, and Northern sort of cover these peoples that somehow are involved in creating modern post-classical Europe. Now, terminology is really confusing. And you also get the word Deutsch being used to denote these tribes and Teutonic and some other terms. Just to illustrate this confusion, for example, August Wilhelm Schlegel, who is one of the kind of key architects of this construction, in 1803, in his Berlin lectures, he says, Deutsche Stämme waren es, welche durch den Umsturz des abendländischen römischen Reiches im Süden, dann durch Ausbreitung im Norden, das neuere Europa gründeten und erfüllten. That's exactly this, these kind of Germanics, sort of Rome is declining and they build the neuere Europa. That's 1803. In 1808, he says almost the same thing, but now, nächst dem Christentum ist die Bildung Europas seit dem Anfang des Mittelalters durch die germanische Stammart der nordischen Eroberer entschieden worden. So slight change of terminology. Deutsche Stämme become germanische Stämme, nordische Eroberer, but still this kind of Germanic northern idea. And he already in 1803 elaborated on what he meant with this Christianity and Europe and Middle Ages. He says, so bewährt sich das Christentum demnach als Grundprinzip der Einheit Europas, Unity of Europe. Das andere Element der Einheit war die deutsche Stammesart. There is again, he's still talking about deutsche Stammesart. If he'd said this in 1808, he probably would have said germanische Stammesart. Aus diesen beiden, zusammen mit den Trümmern des klassischen Altertums, muss die neuere Geschichte konstruiert werden. Aus der Kombination der kernigen und redlichen Tapferkeit des deutschen Nordens mit dem Christentum ging der ritterliche Geist hervor. Eine glänzende, in der Geschichte bisher beispiellose Erscheinung. Das ist quite keen on that. So we have these different elements, these kind of germanische Stammart, Christentum, and some legacy of klassisches Altertum creates something new. Der ritterliche Geist, based on Christianity and this kernige, redliche Tapferkeit des deutschen Nordens. That's quite interesting, quite hard to translate. Tapferkeit, courage, bravery, braveness, redlich, honest, upright, kernig. Now that's quite tough. Somewhere sort of between a robust, earthy, to the point, strong without thrills. Well, but this basically is the sort of great equation, ancient Germanic culture plus Christianity, two very different things merge, and the modern world emerges. Key elements, or one key element, is chivalry, der ritterliche Geist, and this happens during the Middle Ages. And this is an almost mantra-like equation that you come across again and again. So while certainly sort of up to the very late 18th century, the English were still referring to this as Gothic tribes, it's Walter Scott really who begins to use something that sounds a bit like Germanic. When he writes his essay on chivalry, 1815, for the Encyclopedia Britannica, Scott has read his August Wilhelm Schlegel. And he now says, early versions of chivalry originate, quote, in the German forests. So is this Deutsch or Germanisch? Well, he goes on, the institution of chivalry has often been traced to the German tribes. So culture is German, Deutsch, Germanisch. And again, German chivalry sort of blends with Christianity to culturally mature. And as Christian chivalry, it distinguishes the moderns from the ancients. And this development goes hand in hand with, quote, establishment of the modern states of Europe on Rome's ruins. So the cultural marker of modern Europe. And he says its effects may still be traced in European manners. So again, German Germanic is broadly European. Now, almost 30 years later, Thomas Arnold comes out with something that sounds really startling now. In 1842, in his inaugural lecture, Arnold says, our English race is the German race. Now, he probably, well, it might be better translated as Germanic race. But he elaborates what he means, and that makes things quite clear. He says, our Norman fathers learned to speak a stranger's language. Okay, we'll come back to that. Yet in blood, they were the Saxons' brethren. Both alike belong to the Teutonic or German stock. If we consider the Roman Empire in the 4th century, it gives a bit of context now, we shall find in it Christianity, all the intellectual treasures of Greece, all the social and political wisdom of Rome. What is not there was simply the German race and the peculiar qualities that characterize it. This one addition was of such power that it changed the character of the whole mass. The peculiar stamp of the Middle Ages is wholly German. So Arnold too makes German Germanic this broadly European thing, and German and Teutonic are synonymous. Now, he seems to exclude the French or the Franks, or who else would be the stranger's language that the Normans took on. They must be either Romanized Celts or Romanized Germanics. So are they included, the stranger's tongue? Well, not for very, well, they're not excluded for very long, because a bit I left out in the quote talks of a significant admixture, where he says, the importance of this German and Teutonic stock is plain from this, that's creating the medieval world, that its admixture with the Celtic and the Roman races at the fall of the Western Empire has changed the whole face of Europe. So there is hybridity here in this identity, but for Arnold, it's quite clear that the Germanic or the German element is the dynamic one. Now, where does this kind of vagueness, this range come from? Well, the short answer to that is Tacitus. Tacitus, in his Germania, basically Germani, he made up this term as a blanket term to cover all the various northern tribes sort of to the north of the empire. And for him, it was really a differentiation between the Germanic, the Germani, and Roman civilization. So again, this ancient modern, but that's where this kind of vast sweep of the Germani come from. So What does this identity stand for? It captures, in the first instance, Northern identity versus classical identity. It's a vindication of Europe, Northern Europe, post-classical Europe, in relation to classical antiquity, Renaissance, and the dominant neoclassicism. It's different from that, apparently. It's against neoclassicism, that prescriptive neoclassicism that enforces rigid rules in art, possibly even in social order, hierarchies. It's too prescriptive. That's why this Northern identity is set against it. Content, well, we've heard chivalry. This is a sort of personal integrity, a strong sense of honor, honesty, loyalty, duty, the integrity of the knight chivalry, or of the gentleman. We'll come back to him. But it's already an ancient Germanic chivalry that kind of is refined by Christianity. What August Wilhelm Schlegel called this kernige und redliche Tapferkeit. So there's chivalry, but there's one other thing that is part of this Germanic inheritance, and that really is the biggie, and it's liberty. And this is the socio-political liberty, freedom, which was considered to be enshrined in ancient Germanic law. Charles Kingsley in the mid-19th century says, Old Gothic, Franco-Salic, Burgundian, Anglo-Saxon, and Scandinavian laws all formed on the same primeval model. Liberty and self-government were common to all the race. All those tribes share in this Germanic inheritance of law. Another realization of this liberty or Freiheit is the German idealist philosophy project, or as Johann Gottlieb Fichte called it, Vernunft in Freiheit realisieren. Realize reason in freedom. That's a future project, of course. But for Fichte, there was a kind of ancient freedom legacy, and he saw this in the sort of German case as or evidenced by the republican constitutions of the free imperial cities of the old Reich. They were republics. And Fichte tells his listeners in 1808, that's from die Reden an die deutsche Nation, die deutsche Nation hat an ihrem Bürgerstande, der Citizen Class, schon seit Jahrhunderten gezeigt, dass sie die republikanische Verfassung zu ertragen vermöge. It's quite difficult to be a republic. It's a tough job. So, but here, these kind of Bürgerstand of the imperial cities, they have already done this. We have a history here. August Wilhelm Schlegel hinted at this a little bit when, or is slightly more covert, he talks about Europa ist im Mittelalter ein Land, kind of linked by a shared cultural heritage and a common patriotic interest. He speaks of das Gefühl eines gemeinsamen Interesses, eines wahrhaft europäischen Patriotismus. Now, patriotism in those days is a loaded term. It comes from the contemporary debates about new collectives, national collectives. Patriotism exists in non-absolutist, non-despotic states and is linked to a sort of communal sovereignty, a liberty of a social collective. So there is a hint of this liberty discourse on the German side. Now, there is quite an impact of this identity in literature and institutions. I'll just pick two examples out. I go back to Scott, Ivanhoe, the novel, 1819. One of the characters, Cedric, that upright last Saxon lord of the manor, says, I will die a Saxon, true in word and open in deed. Open in deed means I do things in public. There is a hint of the res publica, politics conducted in public for all to see. So this is not like an arcane system, cameralism, absolutism or despotism. He's true in word, he says, means he tells the truth. He means what he says. He is trustworthy. He is only beholden to his conscience. He is not bound. He's free. In this context, it is maybe interesting that the motto of the London Stock Exchange is, "My word is my bond." And the idea is that this bond is freely given, but it's unbreakable. It doesn't need contracts or legalistic writing. According to the London Stock Exchange website, the motto was established in 1923. The Urban Dictionary claims it has been in circulation and used since 1801. So I shall look into this. So the result, though, is that Europe's history, the history of these northern peoples, is that of societies of free peoples, or free men, as they would have said in the 19th century, freely associated and committed. And apparently there is this historical evidence for this. So, what is this good for? At the time, and if we're talking sort of 1770 to 1830, this identity supports largely, in the broadest possible way, the middle classes in Britain and Germany, very broadest sense, in their social challenge to achieve participation and enfranchisement. The aim is secular citizenship in a more equal national community. So this is liberty in a political sense, but there's also this personal integrity, a commitment to be a citizen in a community, to have public spirit. And the challenge has historical legitimacy. This identity goes back to our ancestors, our traditions, our culture. This is our right. So the Germanic identity sort of is used as a sort of historical telos that legitimizes. Now, I want to have a quick look at how these things play out slightly separately in Germany and in England. Germany first. So I go back to Fichte again, 1808. He speaks of Germania, okay? And he calls them ein ursprünglicher Grundstamm, a sort of undifferentiated base. Again, the purpose is to bring ancient Europe and Christianity into some sort of relation. But he now goes on to say there are Germania, and there are some among them who are slightly different, the Germans, who stayed in their original homelands, he says, and they kept their original language, very important to him, and they kept their political customs. He speaks of a Germanische Ursitte, Germanic original culture. Politically, this is apparently, quote, ein Staatenbund unter beschränktem Oberhaupt, so a sort of confederation under restricted authority. That's the Ursitte. But other Germania who settled in former Roman territories gradually developed a more centralized, unbeschränkte monarchy. So a kind of absolute monarchy is the result of if you move into Roman territories. So he's really talking about French, but Germanic political Ursitte is not absolutism, not despotism. It's the opposite. And the Germans, because they sort of stayed put, they kind of kept their Ursitte and their language, they remain close to this undifferentiated base. The Stammvolk, sometimes even Urvolk der neuen Welt, and Ursprache der neuen Welt is theirs, while andere Stämme are sort of abgerissen, they've kind of become separated. The key point here is this: while all others left and did their own thing, the Germanische Deutsche remained put and they preserved things, but there is a sort of sense that they did not differentiate. I think there's a link to this notion of depth and seriousness in German thinking. You can return to them like to a storehouse of possibilities if a rethink or something new is required. They're sort of metaphorical stem cells almost. But there's something's happening here. There is a national particularity, the Germanic, that becomes a sort of extended particularity, almost verging on universality. The Germanics are specific. They embody the modern European people per se. But there's also a sort of potentially global mission, if you think about this Vernunft und Freiheit realisieren. Something very similar happens when Fichte and Schlegel talk about the German language, a sort of extended particularity. The German romantic notion of the German language is a young literary language, but Fichte thinks it's a very communicative europäische Ursprache. It is capable of translating all other languages. August Wilhelm Schlegel had suggested this even earlier. I only have the English quote here. Schlegel said in 1800, only a many-sided receptivity for foreign national poetry, he's talking about translation, makes progress possible in the faithful reproduction of poems. I believe we are on the way to invent the true art of poetic translation. This fame has been reserved for the Germans because of this many-sided receptivity in their language and culture. So again, the Germans as communicators of diverse cultures on their sort of based on their undifferentiated Germanic root, their cultural openness, or maybe it's an undefinedness. Quick look at England. How does the Germanic play out here? Well, basically in the way what Herbert Butterfield called the Whig interpretation of history, with a focus on liberty and liberation from external change wherever this liberty is suppressed. It's a well-known kind of mantra again. From the Magna Carta, taking back control from, well, early absolutism, one must assume, via the Reformation, taking back control from Rome, to this consolidation of liberty at the Glorious Revolution in 1688, and then gradually the Reform Acts of the 19th century, greater enfranchisement gradually for more and more people. So the independent, free, sovereign people reasserts itself at every turn. This is useful for conservative and radical purposes. Edmund Burke, for example, does both. As a Whig, he supported the American Revolution as a rightful assertion of liberty and independence. The Americans are a sort of chip of the old block, really. But by 1790, he's horrified by the French Revolution. That's really dangerous, particularly for Britain. Britain doesn't need a revolution because it's already liberated. His contemporary, the radical Jacobin John Thelwall, on the other hand, really thought Britain needed a revolution because it's so despotic. But Thelwall also has recourse to this trajectory of English liberty. He says, our old constitutional writers considered the king as none other than the magistrate of the Republic of England. Now, one feels slightly reminded of the beschränkte Oberhaupt in Fichte. But was this English liberty really Germanic? Yes. We've already heard from Kingsley with all the kind of these tribes, Anglo-Saxons, Burgundian, Gothic, they all have this liberty in self-government. But Kingsley thinks it was only really preserved in England. And to make absolutely clear how Germanic this is, he says, we brought the British Constitution with us out of the bogs of Jutland. It has done us a good service and will do till we have carried it right round the world. Here, the Germanic becomes the basis for legitimizing empire on the basis of political and legal superiority. Exporting the political light around the world, global spread, becomes, well, it's one of the key kind of reasons why how the empire kind of legitimated itself. The young Charles Wentworth Dilke, when he was writing up his grand tour, which had taken him not around Europe, but around the empire, India, Australia, North America, he writes all this up. He starts his book, this is 1868, with the following: "My fellow and my guide on my travels is a conception of the grandeur of our race, already girdling the earth. In America, the peoples of the earth are fused together. They are run into an English mold. Alfred's laws and Chaucer's tongue are theirs. Through America, Britain is speaking to the world." He fills 2 volumes of his travels, and he calls it Greater Britain. And at the end, there is this fervent admonition that the destiny of a free humanity depended on the spread of British political culture around the world. Now, we have to note that both Kingsley and Dilke were liberals. They were left-wing politically. Dilke worked for legalizing the labor unions. He was mainly a politician, an intellectual, kind of Victorian intellectual politician, legalizing the labor unions and increased female suffrage. Kingsley, slightly older, mid-century, was close to the Christian socialism movement. So both Kingsley and Dilke clearly really believed in this Germanic liberty, like Fichte and Maike Oergel believed in this Vernunft in Freiheit realisieren. So we note, both English and German writers or thinkers agree what the medievalized Germanic heritage is about: liberty and Christianity, or personal integrity. They make claims that they each have the best preserved elements. There is competition. But they agree that their thing needs to be exported for the greater good of humanity. Now, there is, of course, a huge element of self-aggrandizement on a dangerous scale here. What are the differences? So, liberty English is about political and legal liberties, restricted and constitutional government. But from 1798, as we saw with Burke, a conservatism enters into this Whig history of liberty. From Burke to Palmerston, British mainstream politicians were terrified of revolution. Britain didn't need this anymore. It had done that already. German liberty, or liberty German, traditionally more concerned about thought, philosophy, those intangible geistig things, language and ideas, and hence dangerously unstable, not rooted in real practice. You get the cliche of the mad philosophers, and not so much the cliche of the unhinged dictators. And there is, of course, truth to this. But going back to Fichte's words above and to the hints of August Wilhelm Schlegel, there is a 19th century kind of liberty story of the Germanic as well. And there is vigorous political use of the Germanic identity and its liberty discourse in the German liberal tradition, that kind of liberal constitutional tradition. It is almost possible, if you wanted, to tell a German Whig history of the Germanic. If you want, it's just much more frustrating. It would go like this. There is this Germanic inheritance of liberty and limited government. But at the moment, it's completely repressed. The aim must be a constitutional Germany, either as one state, that's the radical fringe, or as a sort of Staatenbund, where all the states have a constitution. This really is the kind of idea that kind of fires the propaganda of the wars of the liberation against Napoleon, the Befreiungskriege. And it's also the kind of, well, propaganda or the ideas that support the agitation against the reactionary turn following the Congress of Vienna, a sort of Germanic liberty. It then is, of course, repressed, and it re-emerges first in the early 1830s, Hambacher Fest, and again, of course, it has its great outing in 1848-89 when an all-German parliament is elected to agree an all-German constitution. Now, if I could have the picture, I put one picture to show you all, because one of these kind of, or what connects the propaganda of the Befreiungskriege, the agitation against the reactionary turn after the Congress of Vienna, the flags on the Hambacher Fest, or what goes on in the all-German parliament in Frankfurt in 1848-49 in the Paulskirche. It's a story that is linked in color. And here you have Germania in Schwarz-Rot-Gold. Now, this is a painting that was specifically made before the Paulskirche in 1848-49. It's attributed, but it was probably painted by a collective. And it looks very modern, I always think, because it has the kind of German flag as we know it today. Now, the story of this flag, of the German tricolor, it commemorates the wars of liberation. It commemorates the uniforms of the Lützower Jäger, that emblematic volunteer unit, Schwarz-Rot-Gold. It was on the flags at the Hambacher Fest, and the Paulskirche in 1848-49 for that constitution meeting is decked out in these colors. Now, significantly, it was not chosen as a German flag when the Kaiserreich starts in 1870, but it reappears as the flag of the Weimar Republic, and of course as the two post-45 German republics. So if you wanted to create a German liberty story based on the Germanic, the connecting thread here is the colors. And this is very much the telos that the very popular ZDF history series, Die Deutschen, Fragen an die deutsche Geschichte, tried to tell. It's sort of from the Reformation to the Bundesrepublik, or at least from the Befreiungskriege to the Bundesrepublik. That's the sort of the trajectory. As I say, it's got a lot of twists and turns, that story. It's not as straightforward as the English one. So the picture can go again now. So what about this idea of the medieval Germanic as the liberty story, this forward-looking progressive thing? Traditionally, particularly in Germany, the answer that the medieval Germanic could be anything like that is no. It's too tinged with racism, the Germanic, and conservatism, medieval, is this glorifying feudalism. And there, again, there's truth to this, but the answer is perhaps slightly more complicated. Medievalism is used to critique contemporary society. The Germanic identity is used to challenge existing hierarchies in both England and Germany, late 18th century, early mid-19th century. One example, Novalis, German example, publishes his Christenheit oder Europa in 1799. Now, Christianity in Europe, you know now which discourse this belongs to. Christenheit oder Europa supports monarchy. It's anti-progress, it's anti-industrialism, it's not backward looking, but it's equally anti-capitalist. It's an anti-capitalist critique of early capitalism. It's against competition, or it criticizes competition, profit maximization, and material utilitarianism. It's anti-mechanism. Mechanism is a bad word for Novalis, but it has equally bad connotations in Coleridge, in the young Carlyle, and the young Hazlitt in England. Mechanism is linked to the idea of the Staatsmaschine, originally a fairly neutral term in the mid-18th century, smooth kind of machinery that works well. But in Novalis, the Staatsmaschine, and also in art, becomes this state as factory that just exploits and uses human resources. It ignores humanity. On the other hand, medievalizing also produces the kind of religious revival of the 19th century. There is a shift towards Catholicism, particularly in former radicals and social and cultural rebels. Always has to think of Friedrich Schlegel first, of course, but there are others, Joseph Goebbels, for example. But there are similar tendencies of this in England. There is the Oxford movement, high church religiosity, or the New England movement, the religiously minded group with strong high church leanings, but with a keen sense of social issues created by industrialism, social issues or even social injustices. So again, there's this critique element. The last idea I want to look at or return to is the English gentleman, or the idea, the 19th century idea of the English gentleman. Because this goes back to where we started, chivalry and personal integrity. Now, the idea of the English gentleman was created almost single-handedly by Kenelm Henry Digby, who published as a young man in 1822 a book, a conduct book for English for young Englishmen, and he called it The Rules for the Gentlemen of England, or The Broad Stone of Honour. Now, this is based on Ehrenbreitstein on the Rhine near Koblenz, his favourite castle. He loved medieval castles. And Digby eventually converts to Catholicism, but his book became a bestseller throughout the 19th century in England. Now, what is this English gentleman like then? Well, he promotes ideals of truthfulness, honour, valour, and crucially, public service. Digby, in this conduct book, rails against refined selfishness and ambition united with degeneracy of mind. Ambition is bad. The gentleman, the English gentleman, is a committed citizen, public service, public spirit, a committed citizen of a modern society. But the legitimacy of this code that he produces is rooted in the fact that it's indigenous, it's our culture, it originates from common traditions of European medieval culture. He says, quote, therefore, in the principles of ancient chivalry and the characters of the knights of the Middle Ages, we must look for the virtues and sentiments that are to be our inheritance. The concept had a profound influence on the ethos of a number of public schools in England, first and foremost Rugby. Thomas Arnold was a huge fan of this. So, what about Brexit? What has this got to do with Brexit? What we've got here are modern narratives of national identity, the Whig narrative of liberty, which is sort of evidence for the England, Britain as the cradle of democracy. Equally, only the English have preserved these true laws. There's an element of splendid isolation, yet at the same time, it is a global need that this kind of cradle of democracy, these ideas spread around the world because of their political superiority. Now, I think with the liberty narrative and the sovereign people, the not meddling, or not being meddled with by other multinationals, be it the Catholic Church or the EU, it's quite clear that the pro-Brexit discourse picked up this narrative, which was ready, it was lying there, it was waiting, especially this kind of idea of freedom and independence, the sovereignty discourse. Now, both Germany and Britain, if we look at the 19th century, are outspoken about their superior Germanicness. But in the British context, the English identity is perhaps more separatist. It is best because it broke away. It preserved its great inheritance by forging ahead, first and alone. Kingsley again and again makes the point that the English were first to sort of not just have the Magna Carta, but sort of when the Plantagenet, when the Plantagenet kings want to kind of appoint their own bishops, the Becket story is already, Kingsley thinks this is the beginning of this. And then of course you have the Magna Carta, you have the Reformation, you have the Glorious Revolution. So forging ahead first and alone, that's the English interpretation, or it's an English interpretation that fits well. The German context, there remains more stress on being a root, the old block, if you like, a matrix connected to all other later specific developments, and somewhat undefined. Now, Germany, of course, is seen as deeply invested in European unity and the EU. The narrative of European unity runs through all of this already in the 19th century. This assumed sort of medieval Europe, as Schlegel says, Europa war im Mittelalter wirklich ein Land. Now, before I run off with this German European unity thing, of course, there is significant anti-EU feeling in Germany, as in many other member states. And many of the reasons why Germany now is keen on European integration lie in the specific historical developments of the first half of the 20th century, not the 19th. But the cradle of democracy and the heart of Europe, these narratives suggest and seem to make sense to many. The English Germanic is the result of moving away from the heartland in order to preserve the inheritance, whereas the German Germanic remains happy to be at the center. Now, before I stop, these are not reasons for Brexit or a commitment to the EU. These are discourses. These are stories that can be used to support interpretations of contemporary economic, political, social realities. But they are stories, they are constructions. I think I'll leave it to that.
Thank you very much indeed, Maike, for this, well, almost provocative thesis that you entertained here. I think we're all grateful to you for this remarkable historical background you gave to the Brexit situation, and your reference to these discourses really amount to this remarkable thesis of yours that there was this competition going on between shall we say, England and the German lands, who has the better Germanic identity, who is the kind of purer, in inverted commas, Germanic character. So, of course, the other thing is the presence of the myth that I think is paramount in the 19th century. I mean, if you only think of the presence of the Germanic myths in Wagner, and the way in which this was received in this country, first of all, as a common denominator, is quite fascinating. I mean, to the very day, we have the Wagner Society in this country is the largest outside Germany. So there is this element of a common mythology that clearly has also various shapes and forms. I find it extremely interesting what you said about Fichte, apart from anything else. Of course, 1808, the Reden an die Deutsche Nation, is also the year of the Hermannschlacht by Kleist, and where you have a different take, as it were, on how can we resist Napoleon, basically. I mean, that is the subtext, is it not? How can we form an identity against an actual invasion? A takeover as far as Napoleon was concerned. Of course, precisely the kind of thing that did not happen here. But the anxiety of this takeover by Napoleon, of course, was paramount and remained very present for a very long time. So perhaps this is also something which we might wish to discuss now. I would like to invite comments, as you are by now used to it, on the chat function, and I would take then chat comment by comment and simply read it out, and would like to invite Maike to respond. So we have a first question by Julia to the panelists. Seems to play out in the speed of vaccination rollout. Britain forging ahead, Germany rooted in Gründlichkeit. You need a health certificate to claim your place in the queue. Question or comment, perhaps you would like to comment, Maike, on this?
Yeah, it's always very tempting to look for kind of, if you like, a sort of reinforcement of the myth in reality, if you like. And yes, there is this, there is quite a lot about, if you just take the story of Brexit from the referendum to now, what happened. And there are many, many points where you feel, or where I felt reminded of these kind of, because I work on the 18th and 19th century, that I felt I'd heard all this before, or this was just another step in this kind of race. Yes, I mean, when I was actually, some of this goes back to a long, long time to my PhD thesis. And it was already then that I was beginning to think, I think the England in particular, because much of this is an English myth, there is a sort of almost a kind of written into their sort of national myth story, a resistance to Europe. I mean, this is a long time ago. This is sort of like in the mid-90s. That it seems quite obvious that this was potentially quite a difficult thing for the United Kingdom to sort of wholeheartedly commit to this large structure. There were too many what one could sort of see as precedents where that had not happened, where it had gone the other way. It's this kind of forging ahead first and alone.
Right, we have a comment by Anthony Harding. One additional example of strong criticism of capitalism and the factory system in England was Wordsworth's The Excursion, 1814. Indeed, very influential for Victorian readers and indeed for many in America. Wordsworth's model of community is strongly rooted in rural tradition with emphasis on small-scale farming and openly hostile to factories and mechanical means of production. The poem influenced people as widely different as Harriet Martineau, John Stuart Mill, Elizabeth Gaskell, etc. It fed into Christian socialism in some ways. It is not as reactionary as sometimes suggested, though its distrust of trade might feed into Brexit notions. Maike, what do you make of that?
I couldn't agree more. I absolutely. This is exactly what is happening, and what makes this idea of a kind of, well, or what quite often, particularly in the last 50 or 60 years, has been construed as a kind of reactionary, backward-looking, whether you call it medievalism or whether you call it a focus on the rural against industrialization, often been kind of considered reactionary. And yes, I mean, that there is a sort of, if you go with that kind of idea that the Industrial Revolution is the basis for modernity, it's the basis for modern states, modern democratic states, it's the kind of the empowering of the middle classes, which ultimately gets rid of the ancien regime and so on and so forth, that all makes sense. But that is not the only story. There is this other story, an early capitalist critique, which goes exactly along those lines. It retreats to the kind of, well, retreat against sort of the word, to the rural, and it runs through the 19th century, and the sort of the Young England movement is a particular example of this. They're quite small, but they are exactly deeply mistrustful of capitalism and industrialism, and because they sort of seem to promote a sort of almost revitalized modern feudalism, where there is a rural community, and there may well be some feudal lord, but this feudal lord has the duty to look after people, and they so glorify the Middle Ages as a sort of, to some extent, healthier way of, or less exploitative. Of course, it leaves aside the notions of serfdom. And so all these discourses they pick on certain things and glorify them and use them. And that often, very often for some sort of, either for reasons to critique the present or to suggest another way. So in a way forward, but they are often open to being called reactionary. You could also, to some extent, with this kind of anti-industrialism, you could construct, which has been done, a kind of history or tradition of a green movement.
Right. Kevin Hilliard, thanks you very much for a great talk. Can you say a bit more about the relation between Germanic liberty and classical republicanism, see Pocock and Skinner, and are some of the twists and turns you mentioned and the differences between Britain, England and Germany accounted for by the existence of two traditions of liberty, republican liberty and constitutional liberty?
Right, God, I'm quite overwhelmed by that question. I think I have to read it again. So the relation between Germanic liberty and classical republicanism. Maybe I need to look at this in more detail. Britain, England and Germany, the two traditions of liberty, republican liberty and constitutional liberty. So is this constitutional liberty, which is which? Is this the constitutional liberty of England or?
It seems so, yes. Constitutional liberty, yeah, probably Backshot would be the...
Yes, republican liberty, yes, there is a sort of strong there is a republican tradition in Germany, obviously, but it's... Again, the twists and turns I was talking about really is this, when you construct the German tradition of liberty from, well, if you don't want to start with the Reformation, if you start with the Befreiungskriege and you go to 1848 from the Paulskirche and you go to Weimar Republic and then you go to, it's a sort of, there are these interruptions where very different things happen. They were the twists and turns I was talking about. You have the Kaiserreich, you have the Third Reich. So it's, whereas the English story is so, well, it is so easy to tell, although it leaves out bits, because there seems to be this seamless sort of continuation which makes this beacon of liberty idea so convincing. Whereas the German story, this is why it's so frustrating, there are these attempts and then there is a break or there's something else, or it seems to be almost a sort of, certainly in the 19th century, starts that always stop pretty quickly.
Mathis Gronau asks, how do the historic and contemporary federalist structures in both lands factor into this debate? So how does federalism play into this?
Yes, federalism plays hugely into this. I mean, I think that if that kind of provocative quote from Fichte, because it comes from the Reden an die Deutsche Nation, it is a kind of deeply difficult, a controversial text, which is normally read as this kind of German chauvinism, German sort of self-aggrandizement. And that's all in there. That, you know, far be it from me to suggest it isn't. But there is another story as well. When he talks immediately, not about a kind of so much about a united state, he talks about a sort of, about a Staatenbund, he has this confederation idea immediately sort of there. And I think there was always this sense that the Reich was a confederation. Even the Weimar Republic was federal. So that seemed to be one of the traditions, if you like, that a German story of constitutional development could build on. That was something that goes back to a very early beginning, and that had been preserved, and just the challenge was to make that work.
We have a comment by Angus Nichols. I wonder if I could introduce a new and problematic term that existed alongside Germanic and Teutonic in the second half of the 19th century, namely Indo-European or Aryan. Important thinkers in Britain classed the German and English cultures as Aryan, Indo-European cultures. At times, the terms is used interchangeably with Teutonic. The assumption was that a supposed superiority of Northern European variant of the Aryan race justified, among other things, empire, especially in India, and the idea that British forms of government were superior. See in particular Edward Augustus Freeman, Comparative Politics, 1873. Of course, we know the later history of the Aryan idea in Germany, brackets, Max Müller propagated Aryan as a linguist category in Britain in the 19th century. So, what do we do with Aryan and Indo-European?
Yes, absolutely. I mean,
Indo-Germanic.
this is just another of these terms that are really in this kind of orbit, if you like. I was gonna, if I'd had more time, which is probably a good thing I didn't, Indo-European, the whole concept of the Indo-European, I was going to say something about this because the earlier version of this, of course, is the Indo-Germanic. And then it became Indo-European. The Germanic is a sort of incredibly flexible thing that you can expand and you can contract. You can say, you know, oh, yeah, Fichte does this. He sort of, you know, there are some the romanischen Germanier, and then there are the Germanische Germanier, and then they are sort of different. So there are various Germania, but there is also a sense that the Indo-European is a sort of the big kind of Grundstamm, as it were, all supported by linguistic research and comparative mythology, and you know what Max Müller does. So there is a constant friction between this huge term that, you know, is Indo-European. It brings in everything from India to almost Ireland. And on the other hand, this kind of constant desire to carve out a particular identity that is more local, more specific, and perhaps more superior. Now, the Aryan concept, of course, is particularly difficult because it is perhaps more clearly linked with race in the 19th century than any of the other terms, which are quite, because they have such a vague history. If for Schlegel it's possible to change Deutsche Stämme into Germanische Stämme without really thinking that was much of a difference, you know, these terms are vague, whereas Aryan seems to be become quite racially defined. So there is also that very slippery slope in the 19th century. One could have focused on that as well. Where do these constructions that in the late 18th century may have racist or racial undertones, at what point do they become outright racist? This is also a journey that happens in the course of the 19th century. And sometimes it is, when one reads the 18th century stuff through, you can read them through a racist lens and it's all there, and perhaps it is. But then there are other discourses that sit alongside that use the same terms that are slightly more culturally based. They're not quite so essentialist culture, yes, but it's not necessarily genetic. Fichte, again, is one of the most interesting ones here. He is very clear at various points in the infamous Reden an die deutsche Nation, although I don't want to become a sort of apologist for this text, that he isn't concerned about race in a genetic, obviously you can use that word, sense, that its culture is sort of something that one can sort of acquire although when he talks about language and, the language, your language is very important because it's how you conceptualize things, he sits a bit on the fence whether you can really learn another language to the point that it is like your native language. So it's very difficult. One has to be very careful with and I have to be very careful with, when one draws these big lines, sort of from one point to another, there are often conflicting discourses that seem to be talking about the same thing. Sometimes they are, or sometimes it's just friction between them. And sometimes they use the same terms to mean slightly different things. Sorry, Angus, I'm not sure I've answered your question very well. But it's around those people, Max Müller, I was going to quote him as well, yeah. And Freeman and Kingsley, where this kind of discourse in England sits.
I just wanted to comment, if I may, very briefly on Fichte, because we are obviously looking at Fichte, the final stages of his life. And when he refers to Vernunft in Freiheit, it's almost as if he reminds himself of what he was like when he was professor in Jena. That is to say, he quotes, as it were, early Fichte in a text that, of course, is highly problematic, where he almost loses the sense of Vernunft, I would say, particularly when you look at the 7th and the 8th of these speeches, which is completely and utterly anti-Semitic. I mean, Fichte's anti-Semitism, I fear, is one of the, shall we say, defining moments in this discourse on what Germanic is about, namely, this is where the racial dimension comes in a big way. And of course, it feeds right into the situation that we have around 1810 in the Tischgesellschaften in Berlin, when you have the circle around Achim von Arnim. They all are vehement anti-Semites. And I think this is perhaps, I don't know, but it is perhaps the moment when one begins to entertain the idea that the road is extremely slippery from then onwards.
In a way, one would almost like to sort of say this is when they ruin it, really.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's absolutely, it's the same, that the discourse, I mean, particularly around the Befreiungskriege, there is all this almost French Revolution-like rhetoric of republic, of liberty, of a kind of equal state of equality, and it's all very, very serious. But then as soon as you get to anti-Semitism, or if you get to the Jewish question, it becomes really, really difficult and racist and exclusive. I mean, the exclusion of this. It's the same with the Burschenschaften. And some people, I mean, I've worked on Karl Vollen, where you have this absolutely ultra radical French Revolution discourse, together with what is Teutomania, really, which is anti-Semitic. Well, the Teutomania kind of, to some extent, partakes of this Germanic idea that I've been talking about. But he's really uncertain what to do about German Jewish students, whether they can join, and he sort of says yes, but maybe not. But it is quite difficult with Vollen in particular to call him, or how racist he was, because when he, in the end, he's hounded out, he has to go to the US, and he has a beginning career at Harvard, a potentially glittering career at Harvard, and he loses it because he becomes a vociferous abolitionist. He says, "Oh, America, what are you doing? You talk about equality and you disenfranchise your black citizens." So it's very, very complicated, which is always annoying.
Indeed, indeed. We have no further questions, but I hope I'm forgiven for a concluding one myself. And this goes back to a tiny point. It's not a grand, shall we say, rounding off question here, but it goes back to a linguistic issue. You talked about the word and the bond combination, as it were, in the English context. I mean, we have one concept that is certainly medieval, and it is used time and again, also in these discourses, in the 19th century, the Eide, der Eid. And the Eide, the oath, of course, in the German context, also in the Middle High German, der Eid is more than just an oath in that sense. It is more than just allegiance. It is something that can happen between groups of people. And it is something that you have explored, for example, in Schiller's Wilhelm Tell, that the whole thing rests on the idea of Eide. And I was wondering whether Word and Bond somehow recaptures this to a certain extent, or whether you think this is a completely different league.
No, I think this is absolutely the case. I mean, in fact, I was going to say something like this, and based on if I had said more about that point about my word is my bond. Yeah. I think this is absolutely what's going on here. It recaptures this. Now, if one is interested in this myth making, it would appear that the German word Eid, which is of course the cognate is the English oath, is it's a PIE, Proto-Indo-European. There is a PIE term, Proto-Indo-European reconstruction, and apparently this is evident in all Indo-European languages. This word exists, and it seems to have this power. So if one wanted to here, this would be, if you go in for this kind of Indo-European, the myth of the Indo-European, this would be something where you could kind of probably marshal all sorts of interdisciplinary support, cultural, linguistic, historical. This is something that seems to run all the way through. This is evidence of this once united culture, which of course what I've talked about is only something that's split off from the Indo-European branch, but still is a kind of large chunk. Yes, I think there's quite a lot of parallel research going on in the sort of PIE community, the people who work on that.
Right. Thank you very much indeed. We all owe you a very big thank you, Maike, for a fascinating talk. And this is reflected also in many additional comments we had here in the chat. I would say it was a characteristically brilliant talk that we heard. And I think we learned an immense amount. Thank you ever so much. And thank you everyone out there for your participation, for you being there. And stay faithful when we move on with our BASF lecture series. And I'm sure the next one will also be very different, but also very fascinating. So thank you again, Maike, for this brilliant presentation. Thank you all. Take care of yourselves and good night.
Thank you.